The night was thick with static. In a dim radar station along the French coast, a young German operator leaned toward his screen, eyes wide as the green phosphor began to bloom with light. First, a handful of blips, then dozens, then hundreds, a river of signals moving, converging, unstoppable. His heart kicked against his ribs. "Herr Oberst!" he shouted into the dark. They're coming for Calais." Within minutes, the underground bunker filled with voices, boots, and fear. Cigarette smoke curled through the stale air as officers crowded around the radar. Lines of code crackled across the receiver. Reports arrived from lookouts on the cliff's strange engine sounds over the channel. Radio chatter thick with English accents, heavy movement near Dover. The commander slammed his fist on the table. "Wake the panzer divisions. Prepare anti-air. The invasion begins tonight." Outside, searchlights swept the coastline, cutting across the mist like swords. Anti-air batteries roared to life. Pilots scrambled from their bunks. In Berlin, word traveled fast. The long-feared Allied invasion had begun. And the Führer's war map lit up like a wound. But on the other side of the channel, the beaches were silent. No tanks rolled, no planes launched, no soldiers moved toward Calais. What the Germans were seeing the fleet on their radar, the convoys their spies described, the army amassing in southern England, didn't exist. It was a mirage of rubber, plywood, paint, and sound. An illusion so perfect, it fooled the most feared military machine in history. The Germans called it Operation Quicksand. The Allies called it Fortitude. But history would remember it by another name. The work of an invisible army that fought a war of shadows. The Ghost Squadron. Before the guns of Normandy thundered, before the first wave of paratroopers ever left the ground, another kind of army gathered in the English countryside. One armed not with bullets, but with brushes, pencils, and ideas. Officially, they were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a top-secret American deception unit created to trick the German war machine. Unofficially, they called themselves the Ghosts. Their commander, Ralph Ingersoll, was no soldier. He was a writer, a strategist, who believed that imagination could outwit firepower. His recruits came from art schools, Broadway stages, advertising firms, and design studios. Some had never touched a rifle. Others had spent their lives painting billboards or designing clothes for department stores. One of them, Bill Blass, traded fashion sketches for camouflage nets. He used his designer's eye to blend tanks into landscapes, making steel look like shadow. Another, Sergeant Arthur Shillstone, had been an illustrator before the war. Now he spent nights recording tank noises and aircraft engines onto massive wax discs, building soundscapes that could be played through giant speakers to make an empty field sound like an advancing division. Around them, strange things began to rise from the green hills of England. Tanks made of rubber, trucks built from canvas, fake airfields with painted runways. Artists crouched over stencils, shading fake rivets with charcoal to make them glint like real steel. They joked as they worked, calling themselves the Traveling Circus. They painted their own motto on the side of a supply truck. "We make it look real." By day, they built illusions. By night, they rehearsed the great performance to come. One that would unfold not on a stage, but across an entire continent. In the pubs near their secret bases, locals whispered about the strange Americans who never carried weapons, yet trained harder than anyone else. None of them knew that these men, the artists of war, were preparing to wage the most audacious deception in military history. And when their curtain finally rose, even Hitler would believe the show. The English countryside became their studio and their stage. On a cold morning in early 1944, a group of men from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops stood in a muddy field outside Norwich, staring at an impossible sight. A full-sized Sherman tank rising from the grass like a balloon. Beneath the canvas skin, engineers pumped air into its rubber ribs. Within minutes, a 15-ton war machine came to life, light enough to lift, convincing enough to fool an enemy pilot. From above, it looked perfect. From the ground, it was absurd. But absurdity was their secret weapon. They built dummy airfields, complete with wooden hangars and fake aircraft painted with meticulous precision. They installed inflatable artillery that swayed in the wind but looked immovable on reconnaissance photos. They even drove trucks in carefully measured patterns to create tire tracks that matched entire divisions. Every illusion had a blueprint, and every blueprint was an act of collaboration. Painters designed shadows. Stagehands calculated angles of sunlight. Radio men memorized the call signs of real divisions and mimicked their chatter across the airwaves. The sound engineers perfected the rhythm of war. At night, they parked sound trucks behind tree lines, their massive speakers facing the open fields. They played loops of rumbling tanks, shouted orders, and clanking metal recorded in studios using props stolen from motor pools. The noise carried up to 20 miles, convincing German scouts that an entire armored regiment had just rolled in. The men joked that they were the only soldiers whose job was to make noise instead of kill silence. But behind the humor was a quiet seriousness. They knew every detail mattered. If a shadow fell wrong, a reflection glinted too bright, or a radio frequency drifted off by a single tone, the illusion would shatter. Their war was fought in inches, echoes, and brushstrokes. Somewhere across the channel, German intelligence analysts were already studying their handiwork, marking positions on maps, and preparing to fight ghosts that did not exist. And the artists smiled, because that was exactly the plan. By the spring of 1944, the world waited for one question to be answered. Where would the Allies strike? To the Germans, the answer seemed obvious. Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, the shortest route to the continent. For months, their generals watched that coastline like hawks, convinced the invasion would come there first. That certainty became the Ghost Army's greatest ally. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were summoned to stage the performance of their lives. Operation Fortitude, the grand deception that would convince Hitler the Allied invasion would land not in Normandy, but at Calais. In secret fields across southern England, they began to build an army that didn't exist. The 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly commanded by none other than General George S. Patton, the most feared Allied general in the German mind. Dozens of airfields were filled with inflatable Sherman tanks, wooden trucks, fake fuel depots, and tent cities with thousands of empty beds. Decoy landing craft lined the coast, plywood hulls resting on mudflats, painted to shimmer like steel under reconnaissance photos. Radio teams mimicked the communications of a full invasion force, regiment numbers, coded weather reports, even pretend morale updates like "men ready, waiting for signal." British intelligence added another layer. Double agents feeding the same illusion directly to Berlin. The German High Command, trusting its spies and radar, believed the lie completely. On June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day, the Ghost Army broadcast the sound of tanks rolling and ships assembling off Dover. German radar lit up with phantom convoys. Hitler's staff issued an immediate alert. The main assault will strike Calais. The next morning, when real Allied forces landed 200 miles away in Normandy, German reinforcements stayed frozen in the north, guarding against an attack that would never come. The illusion had worked. The fate of Europe had just been altered, not by bullets or bombs, but by a handful of artists, engineers, and liars who made Hitler believe in shadows. The stage had opened, and the Ghost Army had stolen the spotlight. June 6, 1944. The world erupted. The real invasion had begun on the beaches of Normandy, 100 miles from where Hitler believed the blow would fall. But as Allied soldiers fought and died in the surf, the Ghost Army's work was only just beginning. Their stage was still England, and the illusion had to hold. Every hour mattered. If the Germans realized Normandy was the true front, they would flood the beaches with reinforcements and crush the invasion before it could expand. So the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops kept performing. Their radios stayed alive with chatter from imaginary divisions. Dummy landing craft assembled for a second wave. Inflatable tanks rolled from fields to new positions under cover of night, just so German reconnaissance would see movement at dawn. The deception had momentum now, a living, breathing ghost. German spotters continued to report massive troop buildups opposite Calais. Luftwaffe pilots flew over empty camps and swore they saw Patton's army preparing to cross. For nearly 7 weeks, Hitler's generals kept the bulk of their armored divisions frozen in the north, waiting for a phantom invasion. Meanwhile, in Normandy, the real Allied armies broke out of the beaches, liberated towns, and surged eastward toward Paris. Every mile they gained owed something to the shadows the Ghost Army had cast. In the quiet after-action reports, there were no medals for illusion. Their victories were measured in numbers never written down. Tanks that didn't roll, shells that weren't fired, men who didn't die. One officer summed it up in a single line. They won battles without fighting them. When word reached the Ghost Army that the deception had held longer than anyone dared hope, they didn't cheer. They simply packed up their rubber tanks, rolled their cables, and waited for the next script. Because this war of imagination was far from over, and the next act would unfold on the very soil they had just helped to free. When the beaches were secure and France began to breathe again, the Ghost Army crossed the Channel not as conquerors, but as performers, bringing their act to the front lines. Their new stage was Europe itself. In muddy fields behind the advancing armies, they inflated tanks in the rain and laid out fake camps under the moonlight. From a distance, the illusion was flawless, glistening tracks carved by real vehicles, fires burning in empty tents, shadows painted with such precision that even reconnaissance aircraft could be deceived. But this time, the stakes were no longer abstract. The Germans were close. Very close. Their first deployment came near Saint-Lô. A small Ghost Army detachment was ordered to impersonate an entire armored division to cover a real unit moving elsewhere. The men set up loudspeakers in hedgerows, playing the thunder of tanks through the night. They moved fake vehicles every few hours to suggest shifting formations, and then they waited, unarmed, as German artillery began probing their position. The shells fell closer with each shot. One soldier later wrote, "We fought the enemy with paint, and they fought back with steel." Some were wounded. One was killed. Yet the deception held. The Germans redirected their attack toward the Ghost Army and away from the real column nearby. From France to Luxembourg, they repeated the trick again and again. They built phantom bridges across rivers, fake convoys on forest roads, even an entire division of artillery that existed only as sound and shadow. They had become actors in a play written by necessity, rehearsed by fear, and performed for an audience that wanted them dead. In letters home, some joked about it. "Mom, I'm fighting Hitler with a balloon." But beneath the humor lay exhaustion, the strange fatigue of men who lived in constant danger yet could never fire back. They were artists pretending to be soldiers, and soldiers pretending to be ghosts. And in the strangest way, both were true. By the winter of 1945, the front lines had pushed deep into Germany. The air was cold and brittle, and so was the war. The Ghost Army had one last masterpiece to perform, Operation Viersen, a deception so bold that even the generals doubted it could work. Their task: convince the German command that 2 entire U.S. divisions were massing along the Rhine, preparing to cross near the town of Neuss. In truth, the real attack would come miles to the south. It was a magician's trick, performed under fire. Over 3 frozen nights, they transformed empty fields into the illusion of overwhelming force. Inflatable tanks lined the riverbanks, fake pontoon bridges appeared overnight, and supply convoys rumbled endlessly through the darkness, each truck carrying nothing but air and sound. The engineers wired massive speakers to the trees, looping recordings of bridge construction and engines revving. The noise echoed across the valley, bouncing off the river like thunder. Radio operators joined the play, sending carefully timed messages, troop requests, ammunition tallies, fake coordinates. Every word crafted to be intercepted. On the 4th morning, German reconnaissance planes flew overhead. The illusion was perfect. Within hours, enemy artillery began pounding the empty decoy positions. The real American divisions, 20 miles away, crossed the Rhine almost unopposed. One Ghost Army officer wrote afterward, "We won a battle that didn't exist." For a few fleeting days, the deception men allowed themselves pride. They had faced the enemy without ever seeing him. They had risked death not by shooting straighter, but by lying better. Yet even in triumph, they remained invisible. Their reports went uncredited, their names unsigned. When the real armies moved forward, the ghosts deflated their tanks, packed up their paints and phonographs, and vanished again, leaving behind only tire tracks, cigarette butts, and confusion. The Germans never learned who had fooled them. The Allies barely remembered who had saved them. But the war of deception was ending, and so was the need for ghosts. When Germany finally collapsed, the world exhaled. But the Ghost Army did not celebrate. Their victory had no parades, no flags, no photographs in the papers. In the spring of 1945, their orders arrived on a single, typed page. Cease operations. Disband immediately. There was no signature, no commendation, no farewell. Just silence. Within days, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops scattered across Europe, artists and engineers returning to their old lives. Some found their way back to studios and design firms. Others simply faded into the anonymity of peacetime. Their war, the war of imagination, was locked away under the seal of classification. For decades, no one was allowed to speak of what they had done. When their families asked where they had served, the veterans would shrug and say, "Here and there." The truth was buried under paperwork stamped "Top Secret" and filed in archives that no one read. Bill Blass went back to sketching dresses, his hands still remembering the curves of canvas tanks. Arthur Shilstone painted portraits and landscapes, each brushstroke echoing the quiet precision of the illusions he once built. Ralph Ingersoll, the man who had believed creativity could win a war, returned to journalism and wrote about heroes he could actually name. The Ghost Army itself vanished, a rumor, a footnote, a whisper among veterans who had seen strange things that could never be explained. For half a century, their story stayed hidden, sleeping beneath the myth of D-Day and the noise of history. But memory, like sound, travels farther than anyone expects. And somewhere, across time and static, the echo of their deceptions still lingered, waiting to be heard again. Time is the great censor of war. It silences the gunfire, blurs the names, and buries the stories that don't fit the headlines. For the Ghost Army, silence lasted almost 50 years. Their records remained sealed, their photographs forgotten, their victories unspoken. Until, in the 1990s, a curious historian uncovered a file marked "Deception Operations, Western Front." Inside were photographs of men lifting inflatable tanks, sound trucks parked in muddy fields, and sketches that looked more like movie storyboards than military documents. The ghosts were real. Veterans, now gray-haired and soft-spoken, began receiving phone calls. For the first time, they were asked not what they saw, but what they created. Interviews followed. Old voices recalled the strange war they had fought the nights spent painting shadows, the fear of being discovered, the laughter between explosions. Some broke down remembering the friends who didn't make it home, even in a war built on illusion. One of them said quietly, "We fought so others wouldn't have to." In 2013, Congress officially recognized the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops for their extraordinary heroism. A bronze medal followed, not for destruction, but for deception, a rare honor for men who had once been told their work would never be spoken of. Today, their story is taught not as a trick, but as a triumph of imagination. In museums, visitors stand before life-sized replicas of their rubber tanks and hear the ghostly recordings of distant engines. Children stare in wonder because for once, war is being remembered not for what it destroyed, but for what it saved. And as the lights dim and the echoes fade, one truth remains. They fought with art. They won with illusion. And in doing so, they proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, creativity can still be a weapon of light.